Hi, everybody, and welcome to this week's multi-tenancy working group session. So today we are going to have a presentation from a team at IBM on their proposal for account quotas, and then we're going to do a Kubecon retro. Shikha, are you on?
Hey, Tasha. Yes, I'm on.
Awesome. Cool.
Right. So real quick, we presented like a few weeks back, I think it's in the recording, as to how our use cases, IBM's use cases on multi-tenancy. One of the use cases that we have is to get the account quota. So once you create the accounts, which we heard was CRD based, and I'm trying to get the whole all the information on it. Tasha, maybe I'll come back to you as to what's the status of it, how we can adopt it. But once you can get the accounts created, one of the requirements that comes to us is how can we manage, administer the account quota, and that's what we started looking into, and we have a proposal that we'd like to review. We'll start on the implementation and would like to contribute back and figure out how and where we should start contributing the account quota.
Awesome.
Paul, are you online?
Yes, I am.
Okay, so we have a slide deck, but we do have a repo where we posted the original use cases. We'll add this document that Paul is going to present in the repo and share the link with you all as after the call. So Paul, if you want to take through.
All right. Can you tell me if I'm sharing the correct screen?
You're showing your wallpaper with
yeah.
Oh yeah.
Island on it.
New Mac has to ask me for some permissions. Just a second.
Okay.
All right. Can you see PowerPoint now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So this is a pretty simple slide deck that I just put together based on our design. So obviously, as Shikha described, when we're talking about multi-tenancy and having multiple tenants sharing the cluster, we really need to make sure that one tenant can't create so many workloads and things that they deny access to the cluster to the other tenants. So from our perspective, the need is pretty obvious that we want to be able to control that as a cluster administrator to define, yeah, I've got 5 accounts that I've onboarded to my cluster. Each one's not allowed to consume more than 5 gigs of memory or a certain number of milli-CPUs or that sort of thing. So to do this, we're looking at doing this with resource quotas to reuse and leverage that ability already there in Kubernetes. So as your tenants create new namespaces of their own, create new workloads of their own, we really just need to make sure that every namespace that they create defines a resource quota that limits that namespace to, say, a certain percentage or part of their total account quota that's available to them. So the cluster administrator would define an account quota, says everybody gets 5 gigs of memory. As namespaces get created, resource quotas get created in those namespaces that never total up more than 5 gigs per account, no matter how many namespaces they create. So it would be resource quota based. It would be based on enforcing. So that's what resource quotas do. I don't think it's possible at this time to define a soft resource quota. The structure of a resource quota is just the hard CPU limit or the hard memory limit. I don't think there's a soft option available yet, but that could be possible in the future. And then, of course, it would be extensible and pluggable by way of resource quotas. We actually started looking at this originally just from kind of like a pod memory perspective, but we also have requirements where an application may be defining other types of custom resources, and you want to make sure that no tenant creates more than 10 of those custom resources across their namespaces. So that actually became possible in Kubernetes 1.15, which I think came out in June of this year, where you could actually define a resource quota on object counts for custom resources, which really kind of cements the idea that we want to use resource quotas for account level enforcement as well. So real simple high level design. We're going to define account quotas. We're going to have a CRD for account quotas. It's going to look almost exactly the same as a resource quota, but it'll be defined at the cluster scope. We're actually going to have another CRD for account configs, which will bind the account quotas to specific accounts. So you can say account A uses this quota, account B and C use that quota, and separate it out, because you could have different levels of tenants based on how much money they want to give you, or whatever it happens to be, how much you like them. So we are actually currently using our own IAM provider to define accounts, since the kind of official Kubernetes doesn't have the accounts yet. But obviously we want to make sure we design and implement so that as the kind of official Kubernetes accounts become available and accepted, we can, instead of looking at our own custom IAM provider, we just say, yeah, we'll just look at the accounts that are defined in Kubernetes. And then each namespace in an account must have a resource quota with a specific name. If it's not there, we're going to make sure it automatically gets created with a controller. And for every attribute of the account quota, such as the limit on memory, we have to make sure that the sum of the memory limits and all those resource quotas for an account are always less than or equal to the account quota value. And resource quotas also have scope selectors, so we have to make sure that if you define a quota at the account level that says, here's the scope selectors, all of the resource quotas that get created in that account also need to have that one. So the orange text here is pretty much an exact word for word what was on the previous slide, so this just kind of going into what's the implementation to actually make this happen. So we're going to have a namespace controller that looks for creation. Doesn't really care about updating or deleting namespaces. If you delete namespace, you're fine. You're not going to break your quotas as a result of that. But if you create a new account, or sorry, a new namespace as a tenant, this controller will be notified after the namespace is created, automatically kick in, create a resource quota in that namespace with the specific name, and that's pretty much it. It doesn't have to do any other calculations. It just has to make sure that that resource quota exists in that namespace. Now, the second half of this is that we would have a resource quota admission controller looking at creation, updating, and deletion of resource quotas across the cluster. So when that new resource quota gets created, if it's that named one that is specific to multi-tenant enforcement, it's going to say, ah, you've created one. It doesn't actually specify all the attributes that your account quota needs. It doesn't specify the memory limit, for example. So it's going to calculate, or not calculate so much, but it's going to check and see if it has that attribute. If it doesn't have it, it's going to set it to 0. Actually, this is a slight typo. I've got this correct on other slides. Let me do a quick sheet here. Set it to 0 for that attribute. So you created a resource quota without specifying a value. By default, it's just going to go and say, yep, 0. You create a new namespace. It's not allowed to have any resources in it until you go back and edit it again. If you do set a value in it, the admission controller is going to actually calculate, is that value that you've specified that's greater than 0, is it actually summing up all of your resource quotas? Is it still less than your account quota? So that the tenant administrator who's creating this namespace, who can go in and edit this resource quota, this will prevent them from editing that resource quota and setting their memory limit to 1,000 gigabytes of memory available in this namespace or something like that if that's too high. And again, if you're deleting the quota, it's going to stop that. Tenant administrators have the control over everything in their namespace, their administrator role there, but the admission controller will make sure they don't actually delete the resource quota that's enforcing the account limits. And then periodically we want to kind of resync to make sure that something didn't slip through while the admission controller pod was stopped or something like that. And then kind of the final piece of this that we're still thinking through some of the details is what happens when the cluster administrator actually applies a new quota to an account that didn't exist before, or reduces the quota value for an account and actually makes it so that account is kind of now in violation. So you used to be allowed to have 50 gigs, but now you're only allowed to have 5 gigs. Well, I've got a whole bunch of pods already running. I've already got a bunch of all these resource quotas that say I sum up to 50 gigs. How do I make sure that something bad doesn't happen in this case? So we talked through some options on our side. We said, well, what if we kind of randomly picked the resource quotas in their namespaces and reduced the value until the account quota is actually met? It didn't really satisfy. Kind of randomly picking namespaces to clobber wouldn't really make anybody happy. Kind kind of proportionally reducing all the namespaces has the same problem. You could have some workloads and some namespaces that are really critical, and if the tenant had their druthers, they'd say, yeah, I don't want to reduce those. I want to reduce these ones over here, which are for development or whatever it happens to be. So the conclusion we came to is that we really can't watch the changes to the quotas themselves, the account quotas, and say when you reduce the account quota, do something about it. But we need to find some way to inform the cluster administrator, you just applied a new quota value, and these 3 accounts or these 10 accounts are now in violation. You need to go talk to them or decide yourself what things you want to clobber. Or tell the tenant, you need to clobber something in the next 24 hours or I'm going to start doing it. Or whatever the administrator decides is the best choice of action based on their actual customers. So this one, we're still kind of talking through some options here. One of the last slides I have is some questions, which perhaps we get some feedback on what could be done there. So this is a simple diagram showing where all the different pieces. So obviously we've got tenants down here with namespaces they create and the resource quotas. As the namespaces get created, it triggers the namespace controller, which sticks the quotas in. Once the quotas are there, the resource quota admission controller makes sure that they have the appropriate values based on the quotas that are defined for that account. So all these different pieces, and again, currently we're going to be using our IAM provider, but we would structure this so that we could work with the actual CRD-based accounts going forward as well. And then this account quota controller probably won't end up in the final implementation because of the problems with actually doing something about reducing the account quotas after the resources are already consumed. So for example, if your tenant cluster administrator creates a new account and says you can have 100 milli-CPUs, not very much, but just a number, your account user would actually log in, create a namespace X. The namespace controller would create the resource quota in it. It would just be created empty. And then the resource quota admission controller receives the admission request, mutates it to set limit CPU to 0M, and approves the admission request. So a second or two after that namespace is created is going to have the limits in it. So after creation, 0 megabyte or like megabytes, milli-CPUs isn't very useful. So after creation, the tenant user who has administrator permissions in that namespace can edit that quota and say, yeah, I know my total account quota is 100 milli-CPUs. That's what I paid for. I'm going to make this namespace consume half of that and set my quota to 50 milli-CPUs. The admission controller says, yep, that's just dandy. It's still below the total account quota and allows that change to go through. When you create a second namespace, it's very similar. It's the exact same thing. You create the namespace, creates the quotas, puts the quota in as 0 milli-CPUs allowed, and then the tenant administrator can decide, all right, I'm going to reduce the quotas in my other namespace to 25 milli-CPUs and then increase this one to 75 milli-CPUs because that's still below my account total. Or whatever balancing act they decide to do based on their understanding of what each namespace is to be used for and how much it needs. As I said earlier, account quotas are pretty much exact copies of resource quotas. They have the exact same structure, except they're defined by CRD at the cluster scope rather than a particular namespace. So they'll have spec hard limit CPU, spec hard limit memory, they'll have the scope selector, same thing that's provided for resource quotas. All right, and then that's basically the idea. So a namespace controller, a resource quota admission controller, CRDs to support those and define the limits that you want to go in there, apply those to a cluster, and you can make sure that the tenants in there don't step on each other's toes too much. There's still the issues of, well, one tenant can create a namespace called X, and the next one can try to create a namespace called X, and it won't let them. I think I've heard that discussed before on a couple of these calls, that that's a known limitation. But as far as resource consumption, this should allow a cluster administrator to make sure that one tenant doesn't just go in there and create something that kind of takes everything and prevents the other tenants from doing their work. So obviously we haven't implemented all of this yet. We're working on some pieces of it already, but we do have some open questions, and I'd definitely like any feedback anybody has on these. So the first is, obviously we can say there's a specifically named resource quota that we create called tenant NS quota, or whatever name we pick. Excuse me, whatever name we pick. But theoretically, we've also seen that we could just say we're going to look at any resource quota in all the namespaces. And if there isn't one, we'll create one with a specific name. But if the tenant creates more resource quotas in the same namespace, we could sum all of them up. We couldn't really see any benefit from trying to look at all of them, but we'd welcome feedback on that. I'm not sure if there's a kind of an acknowledged Kubernetes pattern where it's discouraged to use specifically named resources like that. But that's something we're still mulling ourselves. We're still kind of thinking about what exactly to do with quotas that are reduced by the cluster administrator. And I think the best answer is that we need to kind of find some way to inform the cluster administrator, which kind of is this next one here. Because we know that resource quotas in a namespace, you can say the limit of memory or whatever, when you do a kube control describe of that resource quota, it tells you, oh yeah, the limit is 5 gigs of memory, and it'll tell you the current consumption level. So we're not quite sure how that happens yet. We're trying to do some investigation on our side, but if somebody knows how that happens, if there's some sort of webhook involved where you can intercept the describe call and do a lookup of the cache of memory consumption or CPU consumption in a namespace and add that back into the response, even though it's not part of the actual resource quota, we would want to do the same kind of pattern with account quotas. We're just not sure how that works yet. And then there have been some discussions about hierarchical namespaces on this call. I've only been on the call for a couple of sessions now, but it was an interesting presentation on hierarchical namespaces the first time I joined. And I don't think that hierarchical namespaces would have any direct impact on account level quotas, because as the tenants create namespaces, whether they're hierarchical or not, it's going to create them with a 0 limit for memory and CPU. And then the tenant just gets to choose how they balance it out. I haven't been able to think of any way that we would try to automatically say, oh yeah, if it's a sub namespace, that we would inherit the quotas of the parent, because they can't really inherit their cumulative. So from my perspective, I don't think there's any impact, but I'm sure others on the call have been thinking about hierarchical namespaces a lot more than I have and might have some different ideas. And kind of on a similar vein, I haven't heard any plans, but if there was a plan or concept for accounts and sub-accounts, that also could influence the design here, that we would want to take that into account before we got too much further to see how the resources could be divvied up between sub-accounts as well. All right, then one more slide, and then I'll come back to the question slide and see if anybody has any other questions they want to add to it, or if anybody has any answers.
Maybe we can
ask the
last
last slide I had.
Question on the technical side for design first before we go to the delivery phase.
Sure.
So any, Tasha or anybody, any questions on the design part? And my hope is that once we have the account creation done, and I don't know where the status of that one is, this will kind of gel with that, and it'll be just another extension to that. But that's the part we need to make sure that we are aligned on.
This is Adrian. Can I just ask, what account are we talking about? That's not a...
These are the so once you create the multi-tenancy environment, each tenant is referred to as account.
Is this an IBM specific thing, or are you talking about the tenant CRD?
Yeah, I think I've heard it at other places as well, but we've been calling it account and tenant interchangeably.
I see.
But
okay.
You can call it tenant with tenant quota as well.
Okay, yeah, I actually originally had the same question, but then as you went into it, I figured it seemed like it seems like you don't actually have any sort of external account, or it's not mapping to anything that's called an account. It's more focused on just how you're managing quota.
Yeah, and it's for a tenant,
right.
So it doesn't have to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just the terminology we've been using internally. A tenant is the person, the account is what they have on the cluster, but yeah, it's the same thing.
So,
I have, oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
So I'm the TL of hierarchical namespaces, and one of the integration points we were thinking of doing is basically having the limit that all of the quotas in a child namespace should sum up to less than that of the parent namespace. So we wouldn't use the inheriting mechanism, which we've used, which is kind of like the default behavior of hierarchical namespaces, but you could certainly use it to implement a very similar kind of behavior where instead of summing all namespaces across a tenant, you would sum up all namespaces beneath a parent namespace, and so on and so forth, recursively downwards. That was kind of the way I was thinking that we would integrate the two, and if we will be talking about this later, about having the tenant operator or the tenant CRD actually use hierarchical namespaces under the hood, so that each tenant would have its own root namespace, in which case these two would actually devolve to be the same thing. Any thoughts on that?
So in that case, if your kind of parent namespace is given a quota of 1 gig of memory,
Yes.
and the child namespaces also sum up to be a gig of memory, wouldn't that mean if you have access to them, you've actually got access to 2 gigs of memory?
No, I believe that so first of all, not all objects are inherited from parents to children. And secondly, I'm pretty sure that resource quota, if you have multiple in the same namespace, I'm pretty sure it's the intersection. So you get the minimum of what any of them define, not the maximum. So if you had a gig...
But if you end up a scenario where sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I think I see what you're saying. What you're saying is that, I'm assuming that what you would put in the parent would be your new resource quota, not the built-in Kubernetes one. And then what actually gets applied in any one namespace, I suppose including the parent, would have to sum up to what is in the parent namespace. I think I see what you're saying. I have a parent and let's say 10 children, so you've got a gig of memory in the parent in your quota, and then let's say 100 megabytes in each of the children. What I would assume to have happened then is that the controller would actually enforce a local limit of 0 megabytes of memory in the parent, because the children have claimed them all. Does that make sense?
Right. So basically you're saying that instead of how I described it as a kind of a cluster level quota definition, you would put the quota as a CRD resource in the top level namespace for a tenant.
That's right.
And then that tenant could create sub namespaces, and those are all, because they are sub namespaces of the parent, would be able to find that account level quota or tenant level quota and make sure that all the sub ones sum up to less than that one. And then the parent namespace itself would have 0 enforced. You can't put anything in the parent.
Well, you could put something in the parent, but then it would subtract from what's allowed in the children.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, it would, although I'd worry about letting tenants have kind of administrator abilities to edit and create things in the parent, because then they'd be able to potentially edit the actual account quota itself as well. Obviously, other things could prevent that with an admission controller or something like that. But that would be my concern with using that model rather than kind of literally defining it at the cluster level that only the cluster admin can see and edit it.
Okay, I can think about that. Sorry, somebody else is trying to say something too.
Yeah, this Akin. So I believe at the hierarchical level, for the hierarchical namespace, with the parent-child relationship, there'll probably still be an admission controller at that level to enforce, to ensure that the children doesn't modify what the parent can actually give and over subscribe for what the parent can actually also give. So that could be another consideration at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And with the hierarchical namespaces, is a tenant who has access to a kind of a sub namespace, can they create additional sub namespaces under that initial one, or can they only create additional namespaces under the kind of true parent? Kind of like 2 levels, or could it actually be n levels deep?
It can be n levels deep is our current
Yeah,
plan.
Yeah, and that definitely complicates trying to figure out how do you sum up the resource quotas well.
Why is that? I mean, to a certain extent, if you have the account quota, as we'll call it, if you have the account quota in a single namespace, you don't actually have to worry about the hierarchy beneath that namespace. You simply have to worry about the total number of namespaces beneath it. Is that not correct?
Yeah, that's
so you'd have
correct.
to flatten it out. But if you have say a sub namespace with a particular resource quota in it, and then the tenant creates another namespace under that one, conceptually, when I started thinking about it, I was thinking, okay, well, the tenant's going to want to divide up the resources in the parent into the sub namespace. And treating it essentially as a flattened tree kind of takes away some of the value of it being hierarchical. Because yes, we could essentially flatten the tree and just sum up the quotas in all the namespaces. But
yeah,
in doing,
sorry,
I couldn't think of a good way to handle that, because it's partly just my conception. If I was a tenant and I've got a namespace with 100 gigs of memory available in it, and I want to create sub namespaces, each one with 50.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't quite, I couldn't quite map out how a user would expect to create one, reduce the parent to 50, make the child 50, and then create another child 50, reduce the parent to 0. And then if you're kind of one level up from that, and you're the one who gave that namespace to a particular user originally, you gave them 100 gigs of memory. Well, now it's got 0 gigs of memory in it. Why did that happen? It seemed conceptually hard to manage,
Mm-hmm.
which you could simplify just by saying, yeah, we're going to treat it as far as resource quotas go, just treat it as flat. It doesn't matter how many layers deep your namespaces are. It's just flat under the entire account. But in that case, it didn't seem to intersect with the hierarchical namespaces as much. Just define the account quota at the cluster level and apply it to the tenant or to the account.
Yeah, I think if I were to map the sort of HNC idea to what you're talking about, what you're asking for is the ability to put what we're calling an account quota in each of the hierarchical namespaces and have it only apply to that subtree. And I feel like that is something
right.
that, and then we're using the built-in resource quota, like the Kubernetes built-in, more as an implementation detail. It's the only reason that's still in the picture is because we don't want to go write our own, let's say, universal admission controller. Is that a fair point?
Yes, exactly.
So yeah, I guess what I would say then is that when I was talking about the flattening, I was assuming that at a certain level beneath the tree, you wouldn't have additional account quotas, but you could have different resource quotas. And at that point, you can just flatten them. But if you also want to have an account quota at different levels in the hierarchy, then you obviously don't flatten it you can't flatten it at that level, as you say. You would have to do some kind of hierarchical summation. So beneath that, you would have to make sure that everything would work. I feel like at this point, we either need a whiteboard or a doc.
Yeah. Yeah. And Paul and Tasha, I got to drop, but Paul, I'll sync up with you later.
Okay. Thanks, Shikha. Yeah, and that's really why I had this question here about sub-accounts, because if we wanted to have account quotas below other account quotas, that's when it starts to get complicated. And I wanted to see if we were leaning that direction as a community or if we weren't really looking to go that direction yet.
I guess from my perspective, I mean, it really only gets complicated if you take the onus on yourself. But to me, you're providing an account to an end user, and you give them a chunk of resources, and however they want to divvy that up amongst their sub resources, their sub tenants or whatever, that's kind of on them. And they have, and as long as all of the resources under that account don't exceed the limit, it doesn't matter, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it just takes a bit more implementation to be able to think about that.
Yeah.
Because if your tenant can create an account or an account quota of their own, and any namespaces below the namespace where they create that one, use that account quota. I can kind of picture the implementation, but it does get complicated to think about.
I think one other question is how deep down is the hierarchical namespace? How many level deep?
Well, I think that their current assumption is that this would be mainly applied to the tenant CRD and not to hierarchical namespaces, although, as I said, those two might be devolving into the same thing, where tenant CRD is basically a thin layer on top of it, on top of agency, not a thin layer actually. It's let's say a medium-sized layer. But if you were to do that, we could simply say that, I mean, it is actually quite simple to stop a tenant from creating one of these things themselves. All you do is you don't create a role binding that would allow them to create or edit this kind of object. So that way only the cluster administrator who is also creating tenants can set this thing up, and then nobody else can create them. And so that is one solution to that problem.
Right.
What is that? How does that sound to you? Like, it sounds like that could be an initial implementation anyway.
What about the
tenants?
tenants?
Yeah, I think so. I think that having kind of hierarchical tenants as well as hierarchical namespaces definitely would be more than we would want to bite off in the first pass. And while I think nothing we've discussed would prevent that in the future, we certainly could prevent it in the first pass with role bindings, as you say.
Yeah, I think that might be a useful place to start. Are any of is Sanjeevan or Faye? They've been the ones who've been doing the most on the tenant CRD, because I'm representing, of course, the HNC, although of course we're all one big happy family, but it would be nice if somebody who works more closely with the tenant CRD were here to talk about them. Is anyone
well, I guess
Sanjeev couldn't make it, and I don't see Faye on.
So I've been doing most of the PRs for the tenant CRD, and I guess development has kind of slowed down significantly over the last couple months because we're kind of waiting for agency and how it goes and how we can incorporate it. So right now we basically have the POC that we've basically been demoing for a while. And yeah, I guess, yeah, I don't know how, I think this is exactly something that we wanted to implement into the tenant CRD, but again, and all of these issues and questions that have come up have kind of prevented us from doing that. And so we were kind of waiting to see what HNC gives us and what we would need to apply on top of it.
So given that, does it make sense to at least think about how a single level of what we're now calling account quotas might work in the context of HNC, because that would also suit the needs of the tenant CRD, which only supports a single level of namespaces underneath tenants. And then if we later need to extend that to be fully hierarchical, we've got a fairly straightforward path to doing so. Straightforward in concept, not necessarily in implementation.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I guess one way to think about it that from a hierarchical perspective is if the parent does not have an account quota, then the child cannot create an account quota. And in that regard, the only thing you're ever doing is subdividing the parent's account quota, and the sum of all of the children can't, exceed the parent for an account quota perspective. That kind of allows you to have as many or as deep a hierarchy as you want, but simplifies some of the implementation, I think, right?
Yeah, and we'll need to make a couple of changes to HNC to support this, but
Definitely, yeah.
Those are changes we were already planning on making, which was to allow you to be able to configure what objects get copied down and which ones don't. And it was for exactly this kind of reason. Like right now we're copying resource quotas from parents to children. But if this becomes a thing, then we probably would want to stop doing that. We'd want to turn that off, I don't know, either cluster-wide or certainly within the any subtree with an account quota. And then you could, and then that responsibility would fall to the account quota controller to make sure that everything sums up properly.
Right.
How should
so
we?
To a certain extent, that brings me to my next slide. The last slide I had was kind of how we were picturing delivery, because obviously right now we're not working with the tenant CRD or anything like that. We're using our identity and access management system, which has an account concept already to do our account. So kind of our first pass, if we were implementing this, will be to work with that. And then we would work on how do we make sure we can inform the user about or the cluster administrator about the current usage of each tenant. And then once the Kubernetes native accounts multi-tenancy CRD is more widely adopted, or as soon as it's kind of officially adopted, we would want to make changes to work with that. But I'm not quite sure what the schedule is for kind of when would tenant CRD move kind of out of alpha or beta or whatever it's currently in, to say, yeah, we should be developing against that at a certain time.
It sounds, based on what Ryan's saying, it sounds like that is more, is kind of on hold to discover where we go with HNC. And HNC, I'm thinking we'll start getting to some kind of real state in the first half of next year, hopefully before that, but it's hard to pin a day on it right now.
Yeah, I think that's essentially the same time frame that we were looking at. We were hoping to have at least some parts of phase one implemented in our own stuff in the first quarter. So it sounds like it would probably be appropriate for us to proceed with that implementation for our own side, and then continue working with community, obviously, to get feedback, put demos out there, and adopt the other pieces as they start coming in, and making it so we can actually contribute this back to be used outside of our own company. That's the impression I get. But like I said, I've only been on a couple of these calls, so definitely feel free to correct me.
I mean, I think that's great. I think additionally, if you don't want to wait and you see some areas of the tenant COD where you guys can contribute to help move it along, that's also greatly appreciated and accepted.
So what's the path forward? Are you going to continue based on the tenant CRD? Or are you going to have another look at HNC? If it's the latter, I can certainly meet you guys and help you out on that. If you want to stay with the tenant CRD, that's also fine. Yeah, just let me know what are you thinking, or do you need to discuss it?
Yeah, I think obviously I think we'll need some changes to what we've spelled out here in this PowerPoint. So I'm not sure yet whether we would kind of go directly forward with putting the account level or tenant level quota in a namespace that would be like the top level namespace for HNC, or if you recall, we're currently working with our IAM provider for the account definition right now. So I'm thinking perhaps we would look at, say, the account config that we described, where we bind a particular cluster level quota to a particular tenant or account. Maybe that should be the resource that gets put in the top level namespace for HNC. So you could actually have one quota defined at the cluster level that's shared among multiple tenants. It's just the binding to that quota is what goes in the HNC top level namespace, rather than exactly how I have it laid out here. So I think we'll definitely need to work together and adjust what we're doing so that as we get further down the line, it doesn't have to undergo major changes to work with everything else in the community at that point we obviously want to start early. So yeah, I'd definitely be happy to meet with you again directly and kind of work through some of these design decisions before we get too much further along.
Okay, that sounds good. You know how to reach me on Slack and whatnot?
I don't.
Okay, my Slack name, to the best of my knowledge, is the same as my real name, which is Adrian Ledwin. That's how I show up to myself anyway. If it's not that, then it's A Ledwin or something similar. I'm also on GitHub as Adrian Ledwin.
Okay, I will see if I can reach out to you that way. I do see your name in the meeting,
cool.
So
okay.
Hopefully I will be able to follow that chain, and Shikha might, if I run into problems, so hopefully Shikha will know how to do that as well.
Yeah, plus my email address is all over the design docs too. And
Yep.
yeah, the rest of this week is a little bit busy for me, but the week after shouldn't be that bad. And the week after that, the one before Christmas, is even better. I have very little to do, as I will be traveling, but still available.
Okay, we'll be in touch. Thank you.
Okay, great, thanks.
All right, I don't think I left room on my last slide for, quote, anything else, but are there any other questions or other areas that we haven't discussed that somebody'd like to throw out there before it falls out of active memory? Okay, well, if not, I'll stop sharing. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, super interesting overview. Cool. So I had said that we were going to do Kubecon Retro as part of this meeting, but we only have 15 minutes left. So I guess I'll just at a high level say, you know, kind of open the floor up and just ask, was anyone on the call who went to any great sessions, who took away anything really great from KubeCon that they'd like to share with the group, learned about any new projects, or just wants to sound off on anything? The platform is yours. So yeah.
There was this awesome panelist named Tasha at one of the events.
Yeah, I heard she was great.
Agreed. Yeah. I did actually find something quite useful that pretty recently Core DNS implemented a new plugin for OPA policy decisions based off of DNS requests, which I think could be super powerful from a multi-tenant perspective.
Based off of what requests?
A DNS request. So DNS lookup to Core DNS can send that request to OPA to make a decision on what to return or whether or not to allow that basically that request to go through. So I thought that was actually quite interesting and worth looking into further. That was the most exciting thing I saw, I think.
Very cool. Yeah, I wonder if we could get him to come and present on that to our group.
Yeah, and if not, I've been playing around with the
Cool. Yeah. Yeah, put yourself on the agenda, Ryan, and then see if you can convince the person to come, and if not, you're up.
Great. Okay.
Cool. Anybody else?
There was a great talk by Cruze, formerly GM Cruze, about how they do multi-tenancy, and I attended the second, I'd say 2/3 of it. I missed the beginning. It was packed. Tasha, I know you asked a question at it, and I need to go back and redigest everything from the YouTube video, and then maybe that would be another good one. Actually, maybe this is an idea, is that we can get a list of some of the multi-tenancy related videos and a small, maybe a quick summary of some of them, and post them somewhere.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. I usually dig out ours and add them to our list, and then sometimes I'll add other videos too that are highly related just to our YouTube channel. But yeah, if you wanted to do a blog on it, that would be cool too.
We have a blog?
No, like a Medium post, you know.
Oh, Medium post. Yeah. Do we have a Medium account?
No, but we could. You know, the world's our oyster.
Cool.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, yeah, so for everyone who didn't make it out, the videos have all been posted already, and I have not done any multi-tenancy curation to our YouTube account yet, but if you watch one and you're like, this is really awesome multi-tenancy content, definitely shoot it over and I can add it to our YouTube account.
Speaking of adding things to account, I've had a couple of requests from the slide deck that I went through today. What's the easiest way for me to post that with the group?
Usually if you put it on Google Slides and then drop the link to Google Slides in our meeting notes document, that should do the trick.
Okay, I think I've got view-only access to the meeting notes thing, so I just need to click request access.
If you join the mailing list and you're logged into your Google account that's a member of the mailing list, then you should have edit access.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to do that.
And the way to join the mailing list is just to go to groups.google.com and then search for multi-tenancy working group, and then just click the join button. Cool. Okay. Well, thanks everybody. Great meeting. Great overview, Paul. Thank you for going through that with us.
Yeah, thanks.
And yeah, we'll see y'all in 2 weeks, if not before.